Friends, freedom is a tricky thing. Last week, we here at Middle Church, along with the rest of our nation, honored the civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King was, by all counts, the 20th century activist to start leading our country out of a dark past of slavery and racial discrimination and into the lightness of hope for freedom. Last month, another civil rights leader who transformed his nation was laid to rest at the age of 95. Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, the first Black African president of South Africa, spent 27 of his 95 years behind bars for his work as a self-proclaimed freedom fighter. South Africa had been colonized by the Dutch in the mid-17th century and then taken over by the British in a war over diamonds and other natural resources. By 1910, a British-inspired so-called democracy set a white minority of 3 million people to rule over the remaining Black majority of 10 million. In 1948, the National Party, which comprised the Dutch and the British, legalized the racial segregation that oppressed South Africa's native population, creating a system of laws called apartheid, which is the Afrikaans word for separation or apartness. Mandela, who I will henceforth be referring to as Madiba, which was his Royal Tembu tribal name, found himself compelled as a young man to change the gruesome system in which skin color bound one to chains of discrimination. So basically, the darker you were, the more hideous your legal, social, and economic disadvantages were. If I were Black, I couldn't own land, I couldn't vote, I couldn't go to white schools, which were substantially academically superior. I would have to carry an ID card around me at all times that had all of my personal history on it. So not just where I was born, but my employment records, my tax records. But perhaps the most dangerous part of this system was that I could not fight a government that could displace, arrest, and incarcerate me at any time for the smallest offense. Does this ring any bells for you? Does it sound at all familiar? In our country, from 1876 to 1965, our southern states imposed almost exactly the same laws known as Jim Crow. Dr. King found these laws unconscionable, and he ended up giving his life for the struggle. Madiba spent decades in prison because he found that to accept the government's multiple offers to give up the fight in exchange for his freedom was not to walk free. Freedom was indivisible. For Madiba, the chains on any one of his people were the chains on all of them, and the chains on all of them were his chains too. Much as South Africa celebrated Madiba's release and the end of apartheid as a walk from darkness into light, we also celebrate the abolition of Jim Crow and our civil rights movement in the 1960s as the beginning of an era of freedom. But how far have we really come? Our scripture tonight is Isaiah, and the minute that I opened it up and I read this chapter, I instantly thought of Madiba. Just to give a little background, Isaiah was an 8th century prophet from the southern nation of Judah, which is where Jerusalem was located, and he was speaking to a traumatized people. Their Hebrew brothers and sisters in the northern kingdom of Israel were being attacked and occupied by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah's king, Ahaz, was just an inept leader of his people. Isaiah saw that the destruction wreaked upon the north was about to happen in the south, and he warned the king, but to no avail. In fact, Ahaz was pretty irritated with this prophet who insisted that the suffering of their brothers and sisters had everything to do with them. Isaiah's call compelled him to speak against complicity with impending forces of oppression. What's so remarkable, though, about Isaiah's oracles in the first part of this book are the few verses that we read today. In the midst of horror, prophecies of war, destruction, subjugation of God's people, Isaiah gives us a lotus growing in the mud. There will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. He juxtaposes a former time of darkness with a latter time of light. The darkness is characterized by the hell that is forceful capture, domination, and the denial of dignity of one group of people over another. The time of light, however, is characterized by everlasting peace. And notice something else. Isaiah speaks this prophecy as if it had already happened. The light he describes multiplies the nation. It increases its joy. And the thing that allows this light to break through is taking the yoke that chains them, the bar of slavery on their shoulders, and the rod that beat them, and breaking them all. The Hebrew people could not live in freedom. They could not live in light without living in freedom. And they could not live in freedom without living in peace. The text goes on in the following verses to describe a child that will be born to lead them out of the darkness into God's light, a kind of savior figure. Now, traditionally, in Christian tradition, this is interpreted as a Jesus prophecy. But what Isaiah's audience would have heard was the promise of a messianic leader like their legendary King David. They hoped for a great political figure, a man who so deeply understood God's vision for us on earth that he would lead the people out of their oppressive darkness and into the light of freedom. Now, freedom, as I said before, is a tricky thing. See, in this culture, we tend to think of it as individual, and we are deceived into believing that every citizen in our country is by nature free. We're also conditioned to think that we are entitled to wage war with our so-called enemies to ensure our freedom. But freedom for Isaiah would not entail the triumph of his particular group over their enemies. Freedom would not be a reversal of fortune, a payback, or a time of retribution. Freedom would be a new era of peace, where all accoutrements of war would be eradicated because there would no longer be any need for them. Peoples who previously fought for power over other peoples, for the accrual of land or riches, would coexist, honoring the differences in their ethnicities and cultures without needing to marginalize each other for these differences. For Isaiah, freedom was also indivisible. So where are we in this picture? How far have we come on this freedom spectrum? Well, let's look at South Africa today. Almost 30 years after our Jim Crow laws were abolished here, South Africa held its first real democratic election. Madiba became president, and his party helped to write a new constitution. Now, this was a momentous occasion for South Africa, and many things changed, and I don't want to diminish that. But the long walk to freedom, as Madiba so famously called it, was far from over. South Africa is still smarting from centuries of systemic inequality. Among the Black population, unemployment is at an all-time high. Poverty in Black townships has created housing shortages, educational crises, and high crime rates. Again, I ask, does this sound familiar? We read Isaiah and relate to his words because, beloved, it is 2014 and the United States of America is imprisoning a larger percentage of our Black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. I'm going to say that again. We, the United States of America, the land of the free, are imprisoning a higher percentage of our own Black people than South Africa did with their own Black people at the height of apartheid. We got rid of slavery, we got rid of Jim Crow, but we have created a new legalized system of apartheid. Now I'm going to throw some stats at you because I believe that awareness is everything. And as my favorite journalist, Bill Moyer, says, progressives are always deeply moved by statistics. We have 5% of the world's population in the United States, but we house 25% of the world's prisoners. In the last 40 years, our prison population quadrupled, but our crime rates remained almost exactly the same. In fact, these numbers coincided with the advent of the war on drugs, which started just as drug crime was actually going down, and the privatization of prison industrial complexes. On the federal level, 50% of prisoners are incarcerated for a drug offense, 50% on a drug offense. And almost 60% are Black or Latino, even though only 25% of our total population is Black and Latino. 5 times as many whites report using illegal drugs as Blacks, but Blacks are sent to prison at 10 times the rate of whites. The majority of those incarcerated on non-violent drug offenses are first-time offenders. They've never been in prison, but on average, they spend as much time behind bars as a white person spends for a homicide. These racial statistics are not a coincidence. But neither was Isaiah's vision for a time of peace, a time of equality, a time of freedom, even in the midst of darkness. Madiba had this vision. So did Dr. King. We can learn from their insight that we are indivisible. These prophetic leaders had what Jim Casquette likes to call epiphany eyes. What he means is that they saw the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. They saw that the individual struggle was really a communal struggle, and the communal struggle is really a national struggle. Some of you who know me know that I want to make incarceration justice my life's work. I'm deeply moved by statistics. The question that I seem to get the most about this is, why do you want to do that? Usually it's with that face and that expression and that tone of voice as well. But more and more I find myself answering, because I have to. This Friday I was walking home from school and an elderly man stopped to chat with me while he was walking his dogs. He saw the books in my bag, one of which was on race and incarceration, and he asked me about them. I told him I was a student of theology, and he asked why on earth I would want to work with prisoners. He was Black, a member of AA for 21 years, an ex-addict, ex-alcoholic. He had never been locked up, and he had no idea what the current statistics were on the prison population. Why would you want to work with all those violent people, he asked me. And it was in that moment that I was able to share with him some of what I have learned. He was still reluctant, but I saw him start to shift as we kept talking. Then he said, "You're right. The system is not just. But what can you really do? You're not a lawyer or a social worker." "No," I said, "but I don't have to be. What do we do when something isn't right? We volunteer. We have amazing organizations in this city. The Correctional Association is right up the street. We sign petitions, we write letters to our politicians, and that's how policies start to change. And also, we treat each other like human beings. It's slow, but it's these little steps that, start to change things." And then I said, "It's me talking with you today." "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right." We can see our nation with epiphany eyes by coming to realize that we are a part of our own system. We are a part of every amendment that is passed, every policy that is created that perpetuates locking up and locking out an entire portion of our population. We can transform the insidious illusion of separateness by admitting that equality is not yet a reality. Let's get into 2014 with our eyes wide open. We are still very much on a treacherous part of the path. At the end of his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Madiba really sums up this reality, but at the same time, he gives us those Isaiah epiphany eyes. I want to share with you an excerpt of what he discovered while he was behind bars. It was during those long and lonely years that my hunger for the freedom of my own people became a hunger for the freedom of all people, both white and black. I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. I am not truly free if I'm taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. When I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. Some say that has now been achieved, but I know that that is not the case. The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just the beginning. Beloved, freedom is a tricky thing. The walk isn't over, but look at the teachers we've had. Isaiah, Dr. King, Madiba, these figures are all proof that each of us has the ability, no, in fact, the responsibility as people of faith to continue the work that they started. Our collective walk in darkness is not ultimate reality. It is our shared experience guiding us toward God's call to light, finally reassuring us that the arc of God's universe does indeed bend toward justice.